And now to unpack day one of the BBC summit, we are now joined by Kganki Matabane. He is the Black Business Council CEO and he joins us via our Zoom link. Mr. Matabane, thank you so much for joining us here on the late edition. What are your reflections so far on day one of the BBC summit?
Good evening, Mbali and the viewers. Day one went extremely well. And we looking forward to day two, which will basically deal with the issues of energy, security, and we'll also have the Deputy President who's going to address our dinner. But what the consensus has been today is that the BEE legislation that is there, which is 20 years this year, has produced a little bit of positive results, but it has not produced enough Black people at the top, Black entrepreneurs, as envisaged by those who drafted the legislation. So there's a lack of implementation from those who've got the powers to implement. So what has been happening is that public sector, I think they are trying. If you look at most of the CEOs of state-owned enterprises are mainly Black and females, but when it comes from private sector, what has been happening is that there's been a lot of ticking of boxes to say, let me appoint this Black woman there, this white woman there, this person with disability there, so that I can get certain BEE points. So the consensus is that we need to, instead of even thinking of scrapping the legislation, we need to then say, how do we implement it in such a way that the benefits are going to be felt by a lot of people, and also our kids are not going to be. And
Mr. Matabane, that's exactly where I was coming. You know, does it seem as if the implementation of the triple BEE here, you know, has been somewhat not been done in the correct manner?
Yes, there are a lot of gaps in terms of implementation. As I was saying, the private sector ticks boxes. Government also abuse it by appointing people who are not competent, and also giving business opportunities to people who are not competent. We have seen it, for example, during COVID, where someone register a company today and then tomorrow they get a tender. While we will leave people who've got experience, who have been running this type of businesses, and then you don't even, when you give them the opportunity, you don't even pay them. Either don't pay them on time or don't even pay them at all. So there's a consensus that we need to move forward. But there's also there's a consensus that the BBC must drive the national agenda. As we're sitting now, you can't tell me, or I can't tell you, what is the national agenda of government. If you go to other countries, for example, you go to the United States, they will tell you that their agenda is to dominate the world. South Africa does not have that agenda. We had it during apartheid, and it was to dismantle apartheid. But once apartheid is gone, everyone is there on their own. There's no agenda to say this is a South African agenda. This is the interest of South Africans. We don't have it. So we've been, the summit has said to us, BBC, we think you are the right people to champion this.
Yeah.
And we're going to run with that, because it's important that we need to have an agenda as a country.
Correct, of course. Mr. Matabane, you know, there's been a conversation that's been had lately in some sectors of our country calling for the triple BEE policy to be scrapped. What is your position when it comes to those calls being made? Because one would say that, you know, this triple BEE policy was there to transform the business sector and, you know, South Africa's economy as a whole.
Yeah, we always tell them that that is actually premature, because the legislation will get rid of itself once the demographics of the country are represented in employment, leadership, ownership of the economy. Because as we're sitting now, black people own less than 5% of the economy as we sit in now, but they make around 90% of the population. So BEE will only come to an end when black people own 90% as per their demographics. When you look at the JSE listed company CEOs, almost 70% of the CEOs are white males, but white males are less than 10%. So it tells you that you cannot even talk about getting rid of the black economic empowerment, because black economic empowerment in South Africa, as compared to other countries, we are trying to empower the majority. It's not like in the US or the UK or the West, where you are trying to empower the minority. So we are running a risk of actually threatening the democracy we have, because when you keep the majority outside the system, one day they'll wake up and say, we're tired of this, let's render this country ungovernable. And that's not what we want. We want to make sure that we bring everyone into the fore, so that each and every individual in South Africa, they feel like they are part of the economy. But you can only do that thing through legislation, because you cannot leave it to the private sector to do it. They won't do it, because for them it's about return on investment. It's not about correcting the past. Remember, black people, women were excluded by legislation. So you can only correct something like that through another legislation. Hence, we've got this broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act.
And Kganki, would you say that the Employment Equity Amendment Act is the only way to force, companies to transform the economy?
Yes, remember, employment equity is only talking about employment. So you're only talking about levels of employment, like the CEOs, the senior executives, middle management, and so on. Broad-based Black economic empowerment is all-encompassing. It talks about ownership, it talks about skills development, it talks about enterprise development, because it is trying to say, let's look at the economy broadly, so that we can then transform the entire economy. Employment equity is only talking about transforming the structures of the of management in a corporate, and that has not been happening, because Employment Equity Act is 25 years this year, but you still have 70% or almost 70% of JSE listed companies CEOs being white males, which tells you we almost reflecting what has happened during apartheid. Not much has actually moved. So hence, you have to use the stick. You have to bring more legislation, because there's no goodwill in the private sector to say, let's change on our own. Is in the best interest of the country, because you cannot have 10% of the population running 100% of the economy. It means you are going to have a skills shortage, because that population is not big enough to produce big numbers of managers who are supposed to run the economy. So it makes sense to bring everyone, because then the pool increases, then you can have a better caliber of CEOs and better caliber of managers.
And, coming back to the triple BEE policy that we currently have, of course, I mentioned earlier that, some wanted to be scrapped. And of course, some have also even said that it is a racist policy and it discriminates against other races in this country. What are your thoughts with the fact that it has been synonymous with corruption? You mentioned a bit earlier on the issues around COVID, where it was only certain companies which were registered just the previous day, which were, being given businesses during that period. What are your thoughts with corruption being associated with BEE?
I think what we need to do, we need to separate between corruption and Black economic empowerment. And those people who are abusing the legislation have to be dealt with very harshly. And we applaud the SIU, we applaud the Auditor General for dealing with those people, because Black economic empowerment is a policy that comes from the Constitution. It is an implementation of Section 217 of the Constitution. Section 217, it says we recognize the imbalances of the past then we must have legislation to correct the imbalance of the past. But if there are people who are abusing it, like during the tender system, during the COVID system, those people have to be dealt with so that we can focus on implementing the legislation that comes from the Constitution. So there's nothing wrong with the broad-based Black economic empowerment. It's legal, it's constitutional, but people have tendencies of abusing legislations. But we should not run into a risk of saying anything black is corruption. The corruption cut across. We've seen Steinhoff corruption, we've seen Deloitte corruption, we've seen KPMG corruption, we've seen McKinsey corruption. Those are not black companies.
Yeah. All right. Kganki Matabane, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for joining us here on the Late Edition. That is Kganki Matabane, the Black Business Council CEO, giving us his thoughts on the Black Business Council Day 1. Of course, the main issue there being the issue around transformation.